Camelot. Even today, 50 years after his assassination, even for Americans who were not yet born on that fateful day in Dallas, even just the photos, they come packed with emotions. But why? Why did President Kennedy mean so much to so many? Why do we still mourn him? What is it about JFK? Well, for answers, we turn to a man with his own family connections to the Kennedy family, Stephen Schlesinger, a writer, a historian, with Kennedy knowledge in his blood. His father, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., was a special assistant and was considered the court historian to President Kennedy. Well, I met up with Stephen Schlesinger at his apartment this week in New York City. I kind of want to start where your father has to make a decision about Adlai Stevenson, who was not only a candidate he cared about, but a candidate he related to a person he knew on the periphery, I guess, back in their days in Harvard, John Kennedy. Why the switch, and what did he find so captivating that so many Americans ended up about JFK?
Well, you know, he had worked in two campaigns with Adlai Stevenson in 1952 and 1956. Both times, obviously, Stevenson was the Democratic presidential candidate. But I think he found in the end that Stevenson really didn't have that will to power, that cutting edge that you really need as a candidate that can win the presidency. And he saw that in JFK. He loved Stevenson and he adored him, but he was kind of too intellectual for the political scene in America. I think one of the connections he had with Kennedy is they both appreciated history. They both understood the importance of knowing what had happened before in American life and using the building blocks of the founding fathers and Abraham Lincoln and all the different things that had happened throughout the history of this country as the way that you pursue change within the Kennedy era, the 1960s.
It then begs the inevitable question that we hear many answers. If he had lived, how do you think he would have handled Vietnam?
This is the great controversial question of all time. I think, in my own feeling, from reading, from talking to some of the principals who've been involved in the Kennedy administration, that he would have eventually withdrawn the American troops from Vietnam and tried to negotiate a peace settlement directly with the Vietnamese. Something, by the way, that Johnson eventually adopted himself, but only after he'd sent in 500,000 American troops. After his assassination, the one person who best represented his views on this was Robert Kennedy, the man really closest to him. And it was Robert Kennedy who led the anti-war movement after Kennedy's death and opposed Johnson in 1968 over the Vietnam War. So I think Robert Kennedy's very principled stand was very much an echo of the way he saw what his brother would have done had he not been killed.
In reading your father's writing, it seemed that he believed that Jack, if anything, was too reserved when it came to civil rights. And when he watched the scene unfold in Alabama, he thought that Bobby would have handled it differently, because while the constitutional powers may have been limiting to the president, certainly the power of the office would have allowed him to do more than he did initially, right?
Yes, I think you put your finger on something, which is Kennedy, that is Jack Kennedy, by nature was a cautious guy. He didn't plunge into things with that kind of vividness and passion that his brother exemplified. Nonetheless, in the end, Kennedy understood that the issue was greater than anyone that he was facing as President of the United States. And he eventually gives that speech where he calls it one of the great moral issues that we have to face as Americans. So he cautioned, yes, but eventually understanding, he grasped it and he ran with it.
We still talk about Jack and Bobby and first names with the connection. And why do you think 50 years later there is such that connection, the romanticism, the what if, for the Kennedys and specifically JFK, that there really isn't for other presidents?
I think it's a couple of things. One, I think obviously any president who is assassinated has a kind of remarkable impact on the feelings of the people of that country. And I think one thing that Kennedy had, he was young, he was attractive, he had a beautiful wife, he had passionate speeches that he gave, which gave people a feeling that he identified with young people as well as the older generation, but he kind of grasped the core values of his country, and to have them killed and at such a young age, after only 1,000 days in office, having these great ideals, gone, sort of destroyed because of this crazy man in Dallas, I think that had a profound impact has a profound impact on every generation subsequent to the whole Kennedy era.
Do you remember where you were when Kennedy got shot?
I do remember. I was at Harvard. I was a junior at Harvard, and I remember hearing the news, and of course, like everybody, I said, "Oh, you're just joking. You can't be serious." And then it turned out to be real, and I immediately went to the TV set and tried calling my father. My father, of course, was, had himself been in New York at the time, was flying to Washington. But when I finally did reach him, he said, "Please get on a plane and come on down." And I came down that same afternoon, or evening, I guess it was. And the next day, we actually, or maybe it's 2 days later, we actually stood on the lawn of the White House and watched the Cassian pass and watched the new president also walk by. I think he was in a car, as a matter of fact. And it was just surreal. He could not believe it. I mean, it just seemed so terrible, and it kind of shattered all the dreams everybody had about this country. So, yes, I definitely do remember where I was.
How would America have been different if not only JFK, but Bobby, Dr. King, if those trinity of deaths didn't happen? How do you think we would have been different as a country?
I think we would have been a country that had a much different feeling about the government itself. Ever since those tragedies, and following the Nixon administration, Watergate, and all the other things that have happened, there's been this enormous distrust of whatever the American government does. Some of it obviously is legitimate. We've seen the spying stuff that's been going on. But the fact is that up until, the Roosevelt administration, the Eisenhower administration, and finally the Kennedy administration, there was a feeling that the government was on your side and that it could be a friend to everybody who was struggling in this country. And once Kennedy had been assassinated, and then Bobby, and then Martin Luther King, and all these, terrific consequences with riots in the streets and the feeling of neglect about this country and a war that went awry in Vietnam, I think there was this awful nightmare that the U.S. that the U.S. government just doesn't work anymore. I think that's the sadness, I think, that we draw from that terrible period of the 1960s. And I'm hoping that the new administration under Obama and subsequent ones can redeem the promise that this country has always felt about Washington.
When we return to this special edition of RFL, JFK, the Eternal Flame. Much like his memorial at Arlington and the fire that never dies, so too do the questions about Jack Kennedy and what might have been. How what happened in Dallas 50 years ago changed the course of our nation, and the America that could have been if only he had survived. That's all next. This is JFK 50 years later, here on RFL.